Brett.
Julia.
Brett, you are a 2006 Toronto graduate and IHN graduate. And in 2016, 10 years later, you got certified in functional medicine through the Functional Medicine University in the US. I hear it's a fabulous program. Actually.
Really good. Tough program, but really good. Yeah.
Yes, good. Now you started practicing a little before you actually graduated in 2005. You were a bit of a generalist where you were trying to determine what your trajectory was going to be in the field. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, totally illegal, by the way, but within 6 months of getting into IHN, I kind of realized, there was a bit of an epiphany that this is the vehicle that I was going to use to help people. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later, but yeah, just helping people with very general stuff, out of my house, losing a couple of extra pounds, having more energy, skin issues, basic hypoglycemia, stuff like that. So nothing crazy, like cleaning up people's diets, and just sort of like evolved from there. But had no idea that I would land up where I am right now. That's for sure.
Totally.
So, yeah.
Totally. And I remember speaking to you at that point, you had an extraordinary passion for Ayurveda. I do remember that. Chinese medicine, Ayurveda. You did do two kinds of iridology. You weren't satisfied just with Dr. Pesix. You did do Dr. Jensen. So you've got two full pillars of iridology as well, which is amazing. Now you have done a lot of work with First Nations. So your sort of spiritual, traditional content for what you do is married with contemporary evidence-based stuff, which I love. Yeah. So you've been doing that for a long time.
I've actually been doing that for longer than I've been doing nutrition. So, traveling all over the world and spending a lot of time with indigenous cultures and whatnot. So the spiritual side of things actually got me into the physical side of things. And so that kind of merger has actually really helped me a lot in practice, to be honest, because I feel like I can really connect with people on many different levels, which is, I don't know, it's helped me a lot and helps other people a lot. So
very good. So you did work in a number of integrative clinic settings. Now your primary focus now, which is what we're going to do this evening, is in chronic and complex digestive issues, hormonal health, and autoimmune disease. Now, Brett has been faculty at IHN for 14 years, and now sits as a mentor in IHN Student Clinic, as a student clinic advisor, which we love. Thank you very much. And in July 2019, you launched a brilliant program called Digestive Health Practitioner Masterclass, which of course is your forte or your pedigree, as they say, as an in-person program on campus. You have your podcast, Holistic Health Masterclass. It's ranked top 200 alternative health podcasts. It's amazing how many CNPs actually have brilliant podcasts. And thank you again for having Sean Buckley on. And the first time I met you, and I'm going to throw it to you in a moment, was for NHPPA, where we actually had Canada's largest rally at Queen's Park for the protection of natural health products.
100%. Yeah. And you know what? That's never letting up. If you're tuned into the podcast and to what I'm doing, you'll know that activism and health freedom is it's just something I can't let go of. It's a part of who I am. As much as I really like helping people and helping practitioners, I'm just really, I don't know what it is. It's like a calling, if you will, to really, help us maintain our freedom, if you will.
Very good. Thank you. I'm going to pass it to you. I so appreciate your time. I know this is a subject that you absolutely love, and I'm going to pass the gavel to you and just remind Elizabeth to mute me, get rid of my video so that you have the floor. Okay. So thank you everyone for showing up, and we'll see you afterwards.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to make sure that we're good. Can everyone see my screen? Just, yeah, okay, I see some hands going up. All right, great. So tonight we're going to talk about the 5 root causes of all autoimmune diseases, if you will. You'll understand why I say that in the plural in just a second. And we're going to talk about functional and practical approaches to managing, but also reversing autoimmune disease. So some of the stuff I'm going to talk about tonight is a little bit controversial, more in a sense that there's still this belief out there that there's absolutely no way that you are going to reverse autoimmune issues. Managing autoimmune disease requires drugs like steroid medication, NSAIDs, and so forth. So that's still very much a popular belief. And what I'm going to show you today is how we can sort of look beyond just managing symptoms and treating the disease, so to speak, and actually peel all of that back and look at what are the main root causes that drive all autoimmune disease. So that's what we're going to get into. Julia did a great job at introducing me, so I'm not really going to spend any amount of time on this slide. One thing I want to say is this, people often ask, like, how did you get into autoimmune disease? Like, what got you there? And to be quite frank, I kind of fell into it by accident. It wasn't something that I was intentionally trying to work towards or I had a specific interest in. Personally, I've actually had an autoimmune issue myself, personally, and I've managed to resolve that. It wasn't anything crazy, but nonetheless, like, I've done a lot of these things on myself. But the reason why I fell into autoimmune issues was simply because autoimmune disease has skyrocketed over the last 10 or 15 years. When I first started practicing back in 2005, 2004, 2005, autoimmune disease wasn't really a very well-known thing. It wasn't a very big thing. It wasn't very common. And what I noticed in the last 5 to 10 years, it's crazy how many cases you're seeing. And I know that a lot of you watching this are probably experiencing very much the same thing in your practice. And what that means is it's become very, very complicated for people. And so my goal tonight is really to try and break things down so that you can have a good starting point. You can break this autoimmune cycle, and you can really focus on the key areas that are going to leverage and give you the maximum results that you can possibly get for your clients in your practice. Okay, so what's on the agenda for tonight? We've got the background and overview, which we'll get into. I'm going to explain a little bit. I'm not going to spend too much time on what autoimmune disease is, because I think you all have a good sense of that, how it's diagnosed and so forth. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the perfect storm. And the perfect storm is something that I've sort of observed over time and managed to sort of pull together, if you will, to come up with some kind of framework to work with autoimmune disease in a clinical setting. We're going to talk about the 5 root causes. Gut health, obviously, is a major component. Food, so allergens and triggers, GMOs and chemicals, stealth infections, stress, which is a major component that's actually almost always forgotten about when it comes to autoimmune disease. And so I'm going to show you today how stress is actually probably the first place you want to start when it comes to addressing autoimmune issues in your practice. We'll talk about inflammation, and then of course we'll pull everything together at the end of this presentation with holistic and functional medicine approaches to managing and reversing autoimmune disease. So let's just kick things off with a bit of a background and an overview. Autoimmune disease rates have jumped from 9 million people in 1997 to 50 million people as of 2012 in the US. So that number has actually increased even more at time of recording. And for Canadians, 2 million Canadians are affected. It tends to affect women more than men. And, the fourth point there, it's 120 different diseases that all fall under the autoimmune umbrella. So some people look at that and they sort of go, oh, well, autoimmune issues have increased because our diagnostics are better, we're capturing more people, et cetera, et cetera. And while that may be true, I think also we understand more about autoimmune issues. We understand that there are some commonalities and common threads with these 120 different diseases. And I'll just say, it's not on the slides here, but collectively, that 120, that group of 120 diseases is actually the #1 killer for women in North America. Okay, so far more than heart disease or breast cancer or anything else. So that's a collective term. Some of the more well-known autoimmune issues that you might be aware of are things like MS or multiple sclerosis, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, celiac, Crohn's, colitis. So those are all inflammatory bowel diseases. Our type 1 diabetes, and something that I'm seeing a lot of these days is Hashimoto's or autoimmune thyroiditis. So usually, as I said in the opening, these are treated with immunosuppressants. Okay, so just think about what we're talking about here. The immunosuppressants to dampen the immune response, steroids and pain medication to help with the pain and with the inflammation. Now, you tell me as a clinician, is that going to solve anything? Is that really getting to the root of anything? Are we, helping people with root cause issues? Absolutely not. Okay. And most of the people that I see in my clinic, they've worked with doctors, with specialists, and so forth. And I think once you get into these 5 root causes, you'll appreciate why working with specialists has its time and place, but specialists often don't know what other specialists know. So, the rheumatologist doesn't know what the immunologist knows, doesn't know what the hormone specialist or the endocrinologist knows, and so on and so on. So you're in a prime position at the end of tonight. I can guarantee you that you're going to pull a whole bunch of things together, and you're going to be in a very, very good position to help people with whatever kind of autoimmune issue they actually have. So an autoimmune disease is an illness that occurs when the body tissues are attacked by its own immune system. Okay, so the immune system is now attacking our body tissues. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Patients with autoimmune disease or diseases frequently have unusual antibodies called autoantibodies circulating in their blood that target their own body tissues. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about why we might have those antibodies, how do they come about, and I think, again, once we dive into these root causes, you'll probably have a pretty good idea of why that's happening. Okay, so when we look at autoimmune disease or diseases, the short end of the story here is that we're going to find, and I'm just, moving my toolbar here, you're going to find that autoimmune diseases affect different parts of the body, right? So if my immune system is attacking my myelin sheath and my nervous system, that might manifest as multiple sclerosis or MS. If my immune system is attacking my thyroid gland, that's going to manifest as Hashimoto's. You could have lupus, celiac disease in the gut, eczema or psoriasis on the skin, and of course, rheumatoid arthritis in the joints. So again, we could keep going down that list of 120, but the bottom line here is that autoimmune disease manifests very differently from person to person. And it's also not uncommon that if a person has one autoimmune disease, they'll oftentimes have 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 on top of that. And that, is really a testament to the fact that there are these root causes that are driving all of these conditions. Now, to make matters a little bit more complicated, what you're going to find is that we can actually have autoimmune issues that are different issues, but in the same parts of the body. So if we look at the brain, we might have MS, autism, Guillain-Barré syndrome. If we look at our muscles, for example, fibromyalgia, muscular dystrophy, the skin, eczema, psoriasis, scleroderma, vitiligo, and the list goes on and on. I think the best example, especially because, my sort of area that I love to focus on, and we'll dive into that tonight, is digestion, is the fact that celiacs, Crohn's, and ulcerative colitis are all autoimmune issues that are taking place in the gut. Okay, so there's some nuance and there's some variance with each of these issues, but when you look at it all like this is what makes it very, very complicated for clinicians and practitioners. Because typically what tends to happen is you'll see this online, in the groups that you're involved in, people will say, hey, does anyone have a protocol for MS? Or does anyone have a protocol for rheumatoid arthritis? And while it's good to use natural therapies and supplements and whatever to help with the symptomatic relief, if you will, focusing on the disease doesn't really get you into resolving the root causes. Okay, if that makes any sense. So for me, I always like to just go a whole nother layer further, and that's what we're going to get into right now. So when we get into the diagnosis, obviously, legally speaking, I don't diagnose any autoimmune disease. Neither do you, unless you are here as an MD or an ND. But typically, we don't diagnose. But just for a bit of an FYI and some information, typically what we're going to do is we're going to test for autoantibodies that are present in the blood. These are immune system defense chemicals that are made by the body. They are very, very specific in their target. And just to be clear, autoantibodies are antibodies that are produced by the body, right? So auto doesn't mean automatic. Auto means auto self, okay? So produced by self. And these are produced and they destroy body tissue. Now, from a functional medicine perspective, there are some fantastic panels available from Cyrex Labs, for example, that do a great job at actually testing for all of these autoantibodies. Personally, I don't really use them. A lot of my clients that are coming into the clinic, they've already been diagnosed, or if I suspect that they might have something, I'm going to refer them out back to their physician or to a specialist to go and get some of these tests done. So again, just purely for an FYI, standpoint, for a learning standpoint here, these are some of the antibodies that are being tested. So you'll see things like anti-IgG rheumatoid factor for rheumatoid arthritis. You might be familiar with anti-gliadin for celiac. You might be familiar with anti-thyroglobulin for Hashimoto's, and so on and so on. Again, I don't spend too much time on this because it's a little bit outside of our scope, but nonetheless, if you see these things in your practice and people bring in blood work, really the goal is, the higher the number, the more severe the autoimmune issue is, and the goal is to always get those numbers down. Okay, and that's really the short end of the story once again. Okay. Let's talk about the perfect storm. And I got to tell you, the first time I heard the perfect storm, I didn't believe it. All right. I actually thought to myself, wow, like someone really knows that much about themselves and they can tell you the day that everything happened. Because the way that the story goes is, I sit down with people in a clinical setting and my intake questionnaires are extremely long. They're 27 pages. They're very detailed. I spend a lot of time with people. But one of the things I do is I populate a timeline, right? So it's actually automatically populated in the cloud, creates a timeline and a map of someone's whole health history. And what I started noticing was that when you look at the chronological trajectory, if you will, of how people's health just got worse and worse and worse, what I would notice was these massive spikes on their timeline, where all of a sudden they just had 10, 15, 20 symptoms that all seemed to just appear out of nowhere. And I started hearing that more and more and more. And that's kind of what prompted me to sort of really just piece it all together as time went by and come up with this perfect storm analogy. So the way that it works is it often starts off with poor digestion and food allergies. We're going to dive into all of this tonight. It's compounded by poor nutrition. Okay, and I've actually seen this in a lot of autoimmune sort of support groups on there, like on Facebook and social media. Sorry about the noise here. We've got my little guy is chiming in, as I said he would. But what I noticed with in these groups is a lot of people just say, oh, you know what? I got diagnosed with whatever autoimmune disease. I don't care. I eat what I want, I do what I want. And I can tell you right now that it just doesn't work that way. Okay, if you've been eating fast foods and you've been eating foods that are aggravating you, your autoimmune journey and your journey towards health is just never going to get anywhere, right? You are not going to get any traction, and that is a guarantee. You're often going to find that there's an underlying co-infection or infections in the gut. So we're going to talk about what those infections look like. This combination of food allergies, poor digestion, inflammatory foods, GI infections, when you couple that with exposure to external and internal toxins, so this could be die-off, this could be metabolic byproducts from candida and so forth. When you couple that with environmental triggers and you wrap that all into a ball, and you essentially what happens is you start to what's called the allostatic load. Okay, so the allostatic load, if you've all studied, so it's the barrel effect, right? The barrel gets full till eventually you cannot take any more. You've got excessively high amounts of inflammation causing pain, which might be localized to different areas of the body. Your immune system is overloaded trying to deal with all of these triggers and toxins and pathogens and invaders. And what will then happen is you'll find that there will be a stressful event that will be a major catalyst that will really just blow everything wide open. Okay, this is what people tell me, it happened on this day, right? So I went to work, I lost my job, my partner left me, I got into a car accident, whatever that traumatic, stressful event is, that is the thing that just kicks everything into overdrive. Okay. So this is the perfect storm. And I'll say that it is always more than one of the above factors, right? You're never going to find someone with autoimmune issues that is just eating a bad diet, or that just has candida, or that is just stressed out. It is always everything wrapped up into one. And you're going to find that some people, stress is more of an issue for them. And for other people, gut infections are more of an issue. You'll see there in the last sentence that there can be an underlying genetic predisposition, right? Whether that's poor detoxification, we'll talk a little bit later when we get to functional lab testing, whether it's a predominance for Th1 or Th2 from a genetic standpoint. So there are these things that are underlying as well. Okay, but remember this when it comes to genetics, because nutrigenomics is a very, very hot topic these days. Genetics loads the gun, lifestyle pulls the trigger. Okay, so just because you got dealt with a certain deck of cards, changing your lifestyle, changing your diet, doing all these things will actually help to dampen the genetic expression, if you will. Okay, so let's get into the 5 root causes. Spoiler alert, we're just going to hop right into it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to unpack all of these over the next hour or so. Yeah, hour or so, give or take. So diet, allergies and sensitivities are huge, right? Pretty well everyone with autoimmune issues has to some degree a form of allergy or sensitivities. We know that food additives and chemicals aggravate the situation. We know that GMOs and poor food choices, okay, so fast foods, trans fats, we're going to talk about that in just a second. Gut issues, right? So leaky gut, I would say upwards of 95% of people with autoimmune issues that I've personally seen have leaky gut. Now, leaky gut we'll get into the nitty gritty in just a second, but leaky gut can be passive leaky gut. And passive just means that you don't have overt symptoms, but you're still, when you run a lab test, you're still going to find that, zonulin's high or DAO or something like that is high. And they actually do have some degree of leaky gut. Poor digestion, we'll get into that in a second. GI infections, I tell you what, I've never, ever come across anyone with autoimmune issues that doesn't have an infection of some kind. Okay, it is always there. That could be a combination of yeast, candida, parasites, SIBO. It could be viral. It could just be general dysbiosis and some form of bacterial imbalance. And again, we'll get into how to detect that in just a second. The last 2 here, inflammation, all of these things lead to inflammation, right? So it's not like someone has this perfect diet and their gut is not leaky and all this stuff, and then they also have inflammation. Everything drives inflammation here. So allergies and sensitivities, chemicals, heavy metals, infections can also be driven hormonally. So particularly, I found that things like endometriosis, I found that oftentimes ulcerative colitis can really be driven by estrogen, which you'll see down the bottom there. Okay, so estrogen is kind of a weird molecule in that sense, where it can be very protective and anti-inflammatory, but for certain people, it can be very pro-inflammatory as well. The 5th pillar here is stress, all right? So emotional and psychological stress, trauma, which we'll talk about, and then of course, physical stressors as well. So we're gonna unpack all of these things coming up right now. For those who are visual learners, you can see these are the 5 root causes. And our goal as clinicians, we want to figure out, and this is the biggest challenge that I see with practitioners, is where do I start? Okay, where do I start? What do I do? And for a lot of people, they just go, okay, I'm just going to put someone on an autoimmune paleo diet and then hope for the best, right? I just want to take a step back. And if you take nothing else away from this presentation tonight, I just want you to evaluate these 5 pillars in your clients. And I want you to say, rank them in order of 1 being the most severe down to 5, okay, being the less severe. And start with number 1. Okay, start with 1 and 2 and just keep going. Now, sometimes we'll get into the framework a little bit later on, but sometimes you got to kind of start with 5 and go back to 1 and then to 2, because you find that a lot of people with autoimmune issues are very, very sensitive. Okay, so you can't just go into a full-blown detox or anything like that, because they're going to have very, very bad Herxheimer reactions or detox reactions. Okay, so let's jump into some of this. Poor digestion, we're all nutritionists here, and many of you have sat in on my classes before, so I'm not going to labor over this. I think the one thing that we all probably know quite a bit about is digestion, but there are many different root causes or problems with digestion. So from the top down, we might have low stomach acid output, which might then contribute to a sluggish gallbladder, okay, which is going to reduce our bile output. Bile, we know, helps to digest fats. And coincidentally, you'll find that a lot of people with autoimmune issues actually are vitamin D deficient, right? So we might be getting enough vitamin D in, but we might just not be actually digesting and absorbing it properly. We also know that bile is a laxative. So bile helps the bowels to move. And of course, if bile is not flowing, then we're not detoxifying properly, the bowels are not moving, and so forth. Sluggish pancreas, so reduced enzyme output. We're going to have blood sugar issues because of insulin dysregulation. And we'll talk a little bit about insulin later on in our presentation. Excessive gas, bloating, bacterial imbalance. We're going to talk about that a lot tonight. Constipation and or diarrhea, depending on what's going on. Alcohol. Okay, so excessive alcohol actually temporarily makes the gut leaky, believe it or not. So you'll find that a lot of people with food allergies, what will happen is if they eat the food without drinking wine with dinner or something like that, they're fine. As soon as they have wine with their dinner and they're eating an allergenic food, they're going to have this pronounced reaction. Okay, or some sort of allergenic reaction. Prescription and over-the-counter drugs, there's a whole bunch of them, but the ones that come to mind are things like antacids, your H2 acid blockers, your PPIs, those are very, very common medications. And then, of course, things like antibiotics, okay, which are huge. So antibiotics, we know, I'm not even going to get into it. We know what that does to the microbiome and to our overall digestion. Food allergies and sensitivities are obviously going to weaken all of this. But if you actually go back up this slide, what you're going to see is all of these factors from point 1 down will actually contribute to food allergies and sensitivities. Okay, so I don't have to tell you guys this, 70% of your immune system is in your gut. Okay, I'm going to drive this point home because you're going to see by the end of this presentation that if you focus on gut health, you're actually going to drastically reduce people's autoimmune flare-ups and symptoms just by focusing on digestive health. Okay, so, and this slide just really says it all. 70% of your immune response is housed in your gut. So if we get rid of the infections, if we get rid of the food allergens, if we break down our food properly, if we eat the right food, all of these things are going to make significant strides into getting your autoimmune response or your immune response down. Right, so let's talk about food. Again, I might just gloss over this a little bit because I'm talking to a bunch of, experienced nutritionists, but some things I'll just pull out and maybe expand on as we go through this. So poor dietary choices, I think we can all agree excess sugars are no good for any kind of illness. Trans fats. So you'll actually find for things like ulcerative colitis, you'll actually find that trans fats and excess sugars, you'll find that high omega-6s, for example, those are actually dietary factors that are fairly well established in the literature to precipitate the onset of ulcerative colitis and in many cases Crohn's as well. Hydrogenated oils, processed foods, additives, dyes. Okay, so all of these things are really not doing any favors for someone with autoimmune issues. GMOs, I mean, if you've listened to my podcast, you will know that I've done a lot of podcasts and a lot of research into Roundup and GMOs. I actually work with the Detox Project, who have a very, very, they're just cool people. They're just doing amazing things in terms of Roundup. But here's what I'm going to say. I don't want to labor over GMOs, but I want to talk a little bit about Roundup. What you're going to find is, 75% of the Roundup that's ever been made in the history of humankind has been sprayed in the last 10 years. Okay, so 75% of the Roundup that's ever been made has been sprayed in the last 10 years. At the beginning of this presentation, I said to you that I've seen autoimmune issues skyrocket in the last 5 to 10 years. And when you plot these things on a graph, you're going to see that food allergies and sensitivities go in lockstep with the increased use of Roundup. You're going to find that autoimmune issues go in lockstep as well. You're going to find that autism goes in lockstep as well. Okay, so I encourage you, if you don't know who Dr. Stephanie Seneff is, that's actually my podcast coming out this week. I would encourage you to go and look up some of her work with regards to glyphosate. She's a world expert. And, you know, glyphosate, what it does as well, you know, so aside from all of those things I just mentioned, what it does is it actually stimulates or causes leaky gut. Okay, which is interesting. It disrupts the microbiome. It causes leaky gut. So if you're eating GMOs and you're eating Roundup all the time, what you're doing is you're getting low dose exposure to Roundup. And a lot of people have actually said, you know, people with gluten sensitivities, for example, are you actually sensitive to the gluten, or are you having a reaction to the Roundup? Because what we're starting to do now is we're starting to do a process called desiccation. Okay, where we're spraying pre-harvest, we're dousing these plants with Roundup, and they don't have enough time to wash down into the soil, and they're actually landing up on our plates, on our dinner plates. Okay, poor food combining. So really the big one there is mixing proteins and sugars, which causes fermentation, gas, and so forth. Food allergies and sensitivities, these can be known or hidden. The overconsumption of wheat and dairy. Let me just say this. If you do nothing else with someone with that has autoimmune disease, if you just cut out the gluten, and I'm going to take that one step further and say if you cut out the grains, you're going to see, depending on how bad they are, you're going to see a 50 to 60% reduction in symptoms just by cutting out the gluten and the grains. Okay, so I'll say grains as a whole. Gluten is obviously going to get you maybe 30 or 40% there. And of course, dairy is another big one as well. So the last one here is a mono diet that has no variety. Okay, so you'll see people that are eating very healthy, quote unquote, and they're eating the same thing day in, day out. Okay, it burns out your enzymes, it leads to food sensitivities and allergies and so forth. So these are the main food triggers. As I said, gluten, grains, you know, grains have lectins, which can really cause a lot of localized inflammation for people. You know, particularly people with things like arthritis, causes a lot of problems in the joints. Legumes and beans also contain lectins. Now, I just want to be clear here. Legumes and beans and grains are not going to aggravate every single person with autoimmune issues. But in my experience, when you put people on a grain and legume-free diet, they tend to respond very, very well. Okay, so we'll talk about what that diet looks like in just a second. You'll see dairy, corn, soy, egg, shellfish, tree nuts, cocoa, nightshades, and as we discussed before, GMOs. So if you want to do a classic elimination diet, you know, a 14-day elimination diet, what you would do is you would cut these foods out. Okay, I would actually replace down here, let me just get my handy dandy spotlight. I would actually replace wheat and remove all grains. Okay, that's what I would do personally. I would just take all the grains out. And you can do this for 14 days and then reintroduce each of these foods staggered, you know, one food at a time over a period of, you know, one food every 2 to 3 days and see how people respond. Okay, of course we have tests now. We can look at IgG, IgA, you know, all that good stuff as well. But if you wanted to just start with a very simple approach, an elimination diet that cuts these foods out is really the way to go. Okay, let's talk about infections. Right, infections and autoimmunity are huge. All right, as I said, I've yet to find someone who has autoimmune issues who does not have GI infections. So what do these infections look like? Okay, first of all, it's important for us to note that these infections are brought about usually by poor digestion, by compromised immunity, and weakened defenses. Okay, so weakened defenses, oftentimes it's because we're fighting we're fighting these food allergens, these, you know, undigested food particles and so on. And what that does, as you all know, you know, the undigested food particles will feed bad bacteria. That leads to infection. So that's a very common way that we, get these infections. Of course, when you double down with the overprescription of antibiotics and so on, glyphosate in the diet, that really sets the stage for these infections. So the first one, and I'm not going to, just in the interest of time tonight, I'm not going to get into each specific one here, but suffice to say, these are the things you really want to look out for and you want to evaluate. So small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, general dysbiosis or bacterial imbalance. So we oftentimes find that there's high levels of Clostridia, E. coli, strep, or mycobacteria, which can actually be these sort of like mold-like bacteria, but also blood infections. Okay, so they're not just localized to the gut. We actually find that these infections are in the bloodstream as well. Yeast or candida, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, parasites, and then which is a little bit left field, and something that I feel people in the autoimmune space are slowly starting to understand more about, are viral triggers. Okay, so one of the stool tests that I'll talk about a little bit later, we can actually assess whether people have these potential viral autoimmune triggers like Epstein-Barr, cytomegalovirus, and so on and so on. I will just say that if someone, if you're working in practice right now, or this is you who has this, if you have Hashimoto's or autoimmune thyroiditis, you definitely want to get checked out for Epstein-Barr. Okay, because, we'll talk about it in just a minute, but the viral load or the infectious load, people always wonder, like, why does the immune system attack the body, right? It's a good question. Like, what happens to make your immune system just say, I'm going to, wake up tomorrow and I'm going to attack your thyroid gland? What happens, right? Oftentimes what happens is you'll have these infections. Okay, they will get out of control. They will burrow their way through the intestinal lining. They will cause leaky gut. And as they slip into the bloodstream and travel to different parts of the body, they actually take up residence in different parts of the body. So Epstein-Barr virus will find its way into the thyroid gland. And as you know, viruses, what viruses do is they use a copy of your RNA or DNA, and they will use a copy of their own, right? So it looks very, very similar to your body tissue. And if it burrows its way in there and it hides out and it's dormant, often what you'll find is the stress will just kick everything into overdrive, and the immune system now is trying to attack the virus, but it's also mistakenly attacking your tissue as well. Okay, so that's really what this slide is about here. So how do infections trigger autoimmune disease or tie into autoimmune disease? We've got chronic GI inflammation, leaky gut contributors. We're going to talk about leaky gut in a minute. These cause microbiome imbalance, and they increase the load on the immune system. Okay, when we talk about our framework here, this is a really, really key point. Everyone is very, very focused on what can I add, right? So what should I throw in there? What things should I add? What can we do to boost things? I want you to just really change the way that you think about this. And I want you to start thinking about, what can I take out, right? If I have an increased load on my immune system, if I've got like SIBO is basically, you've just got a boatload of bacteria in your small intestine. So adding probiotics onto a SIBO case is probably the worst thing you could do. It's going to cause major flare-ups. It's going to cause, the gas, bloating, all that stuff. So I want you to start thinking about, what can I remove to lighten the load on the immune system, to lower the allostatic load, to lower the inflammation, right? And what that's going to do is it's going to give your client some breathing room to just go, whew, right? Okay, great. Now we got a chance to repair. We got a chance to bounce back. Because adding things on top of that, it doesn't always work, right? Rarely does it work, in fact. So this is where we get into something called, and this is what I explained before, the technical term is molecular mimicry. Okay, so when those viruses or pathogens, what they will have is they will have copies or series of their amino acids, and their genetic code will look very similar to tissues in your body, whether it's the joints, the nervous system, the myelin sheath, the thyroid, whatever it is. And so it becomes cross-reactive to self. Okay, and that's what triggers the immune system to attack itself. So the immune response to infection causes an innocent bystander situation. The way I always explain this is, can you imagine my immune system is trying to, like, let's just use a war analogy here. I know it's not very holistic, but whatever, it serves its purpose. If I've got my immune system mounting a response and I've got a virus that's meeting me there, and the battleground is the thyroid gland, well, we're going to have a battle. Okay. And maybe we're going to make inroads and we're going to keep the virus suppressed a little bit, but the battleground is going to get destroyed in the process, right? And that's exactly what happens to the tissues. The immune system is so busy fighting off these foreign invaders that it doesn't have enough time to repair. Okay. And that sets us up for the state of chronic degeneration, which is actually not even just exclusive to autoimmune disease. It's actually all chronic degenerative disease for that matter. All right, so this leads us into leaky gut and autoimmunity. I think, I'm just, again, I know that you know about this stuff, so hopefully I can pull out some nuggets that you don't know about. But on the left-hand side, what we see what a healthy gut looks like. We're going to talk, let me just get my spotlight up here. You'll see these tight junctions. Okay, so this is the small intestine, by the way. When you're looking at your small intestine and your villi and your microvilli, there's three main functions that your small intestine serves, right? It's got three purposes. The first one is it is this primary site of absorption, digestion, assimilation, right? So breaking nutrients down, getting them into the bloodstream, and then off you go. That's one. The second one is it's a protective barrier. All right, so it's the interface between the external world and the internal world. And I want you to just get this visual, right? If you look at a sausage, right, just go and look at a pork sausage or something like that next time you go to the grocery store. The pork sausage is housed in a casing, right? A very thin, like hose, like a tube. That is what your intestine looks like. It is paper thin. So when we look at these types of images, we often have this sort of romanticized version that it's a thick plush carpet or something like that. It's actually not. It's actually paper thin. It's very, very thin. And the third function, so protective barrier, all right, digestion, absorption. The third function is this is where our immune system is housed. Okay, so in between these microvilli, this is where we have things like Peyer's patches. We've got immunoglobulins. We have, immunoglobulins, Peyer's patches. What else do we have? Probiotics, okay, good bacteria. And we want these junctions to be nice and tight because this is a selective screen that allows nutrients and good beneficial compounds to come into the body, and it screens pathogens and foreign invaders so that they go out through the stool. So if you look on the right-hand side, what you're going to see is you're going to see these tight junctions are compromised. You're going to see that the microvilli are filed down. So what starts to happen now is our defenses are down. We allow viruses, bacteria, food allergens, whatever it is, they can slip right into the bloodstream and trigger an immune response. We also find that because our microvilli are filed down, that we now also have malabsorption, right? And that's why leaky gut is called malabsorption syndrome. So we're not absorbing things like iron, B12, vitamin D, zinc, and so on and so on. So I got a couple more visuals for you just to check out. The contributors here, stress, toxins, food particles, certain drugs, pathogens. So all these things that we spoke about before will essentially erode the gut lining through inflammation and then lead to food intolerances, immune system issues, and of course, autoimmune disease. Now, this is actually under a microscope. So on the left-hand side, you will see a healthy small intestinal villi. I just, I have to talk about this for a second. I know I don't want to eat up all of our time here, but it's always so exciting for me to talk about. How many people, you can just put your hand up here in the chat box, if you will, or just however you want to throw your hand up. How many of you have taken probiotics and just like not noticed any difference whatsoever? Okay, any hands up there? So you've taken probiotics and you don't know any difference. Okay, so I can see some hands going up there. Yeah, okay. And maybe you've done this with clients or with family, right? So your favorite, probiotic, and you give it to them and nothing happens, right? Okay, so I see some hands going up. Here's the kicker, right? Probiotics live in the crypts over here. They live in the villi. So what happens is people, when they have leaky gut, and a lot of people think they have leaky gut when they don't, what will happen is they will take these probiotics and, oh man, take probiotics. And what they find is nothing happens because the probiotics don't actually implant anywhere. The probiotics simply skim right over the surface. They become transient probiotics and they just exit via the stool. So I always say to people, if you want to really work with leaky gut and you want to make inroads into that, probiotics, leave it for like 2 or 3 or 4 sessions. Okay, and people always get very, very upset with me because they're like, oh, I wonder what probiotics he's going to recommend. And I always say, nothing. Okay, nothing at all. Because we want to lighten the load. We want to get rid of the bacteria. We want to remove the food allergens and the triggers. And we want to restore microvilli health and then use probiotics. Okay, you can kind of do those 2 things at the same time. But the bottom line is that we don't want to go with probiotics right out the gate. All right. Now, the big one here, and I know it's a little bit tricky on the slide, but I'm just going to mention this. This is also very exciting in the world of functional medicine, and I would say just in medicine generally. I think that, I forget his name, Dr. Something with an A, Alfonso, I think it is. He discovered zonulin, and I really think that he should get a Nobel Prize or something, because zonulin is the only known moderator of these tight junctions. Okay, it's the only thing that we know of that will cause the gut to become leaky. So what you're going to see is when you look up top here, you're going to see that zonulin binds to these 2 proteins, right? And it pulls them together. You see how it pulls it together over here? And can you see how it pulls this apart? So these are my tight junctions. So now all of a sudden my tight junctions, instead of being the selective screen, are wide open. So the higher the zonulin levels, the leakier the gut. Okay, that's it, plain and simple. And what's really cool is now we can measure this through comprehensive digestive stool testing. We can actually see exactly what zonulin levels are. And when you start marrying that with things like calprotectin, immune system health, and so forth, you can get a pretty accurate gauge as to how leaky someone's gut is. Okay, I'll talk about another test a little bit later on that is the sort of definitive test, but nonetheless, zonulin is the sort of gold standard here for evaluating leaky gut. Right, so let's move on to inflammation and autoimmunity. You know, again, I don't really have to say too much to you folks on the webinar tonight because I know that you know this stuff, but we want to identify in our clients what the main drivers of inflammation are for them. Okay, do they have infections and dysbiosis? Is it more of a food allergen or intolerance problem? Are they eating a poor diet that's loaded with processed foods? Are they sensitive to nightshades or lectins or gluten? What is their environmental toxin exposure or heavy metals? And all of that is going to contribute to their stress load, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So again, think about it a different way. If they have inflammation, don't just load them up on turmeric or boswellia or proteolytic enzymes or whatever. That's good for symptomatic relief, but it's not really getting to the root of the problem, right? So we want to figure out what key areas are driving their issue. Let's get them out, and the inflammation is going to actually come down by itself. Unless they have something like mast cell activation syndrome or something like that, where, you know, that's a little bit of a different kettle of fish. Or if they have a DAO enzyme deficiency, those things are a little bit more nuanced. But generally speaking, when you remove these, the inflammation is going to come down. Stress, holy smokes. This is the piece that I feel no one talks about with autoimmune disease. Okay, so I would encourage you. I work with a beautiful, amazing practitioner. She's a really good friend of mine. Her name is Michelle Corey. Michelle Corey and I have been working together for a few years. I've learned a ton from her about stress and autoimmunity, but she literally wrote the book on autoimmunity. So I would encourage you to check out her book called The Thyroid Cure. And we're actually doing a little bit of work together now for her second book, which is called Total Recovery. So she has taught me a lot because I never really appreciated how stress and autoimmune issues tie together. But she helped me to really understand that and to also give me the tools to share with my clients in my practice. Because I find that a lot of us, we tend to go, oh, just go and meditate. Go meditate, do some yoga, do some Tai Chi in the park, and off you go. But if you got someone that's got trauma, which we'll talk about in a second, and they've got, chronic PTSD or complex PTSD or something like that, they're not going to be able to meditate their way out of a paper bag. I can just tell you that right now. You're going to have to do a bit of a deeper dive. And also you might have to very well refer them out to someone who can deal with grief, stress, trauma, and so forth. So stress comes in many different forms. I think a lot of people, when they think of stress, they just think of a busy day at the office. We've got financial troubles or relationship issues. Stress comes in all different forms. And more than that, anything that your body perceives as stress is going to elicit a biological response, right? A stressful biological response. So we're going to secrete our hormones like cortisol and so forth, but we're also going to stay stuck, if you will, in this fight, flight, or freeze mode. Okay, so we're going to be stuck there. And I'll just say this, if you're the person, or someone, or your clients are having a hard time detoxing or really just breaking through and getting just moving the needle forward on their health, oftentimes it's because they're in the fight, flight, or stuck mode. Okay, so fight, flight, or freeze mode. It's that freeze mode where trauma and stress gets locked up in our nervous system, and it literally just shuts everything down, where you can't detox. It doesn't matter what you try. You can use laxatives, you can use cholagogues, you can do all of this stuff, and your body's just not going to detox. It's just going to shut down because you're in that fight, flight, or freeze, okay, particularly the freeze mode. So you can see here on our list, repressed anger, depression, isolation, poor sleep, emotional trauma, general life stresses. These are all psychological stressors. And then, of course, we've got physical stressors, such as poor nutrition, chemicals, toxins, EMFs, parasites, and infections. I think that a lot of people underappreciate the fact that chronic infections and parasites are actually stressors, right? We sort of conveniently bypass that and we say, oh, well, I got food allergies and I got SIBO and I got whatever. Oh, but I'm meditating over here and I'm making sure to de-stress my life. Those internal stressors often are more problematic than the external stressors that you might perceive more or be more consciously aware of as stressors. So when we look at stress, what is its implications with regards to autoimmune disease, or what does it do, right? Stress typically leads to unhealthy coping patterns, which are often self-destructive. So you'll find a lot of people with autoimmune issues tend to binge drink. Okay, they might smoke a lot of marijuana and cannabis just to try and calm that central nervous system down, right? To get themselves out of that fight, flight, or freeze mode. And of course, as we know, we discussed alcohol, weed, all that sort of stuff. It might be a crutch in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to significantly contribute to some of those physiological issues that we spoke about. We know that stress contributes to inflammation. This is a big one. Cortisol raises or causes blood sugar imbalances. Okay, so we know that cortisol's message, among many other things, is to stimulate the release of insulin. Okay, so insulin, or also what's called gluconeogenesis, so the production of glucose, right? So make sugar so that I can fight or I can run away. Okay, that's our fight or flight response. But high insulin, most people don't know this, high insulin is actually pro-inflammatory, because what it does is it converts a lot of those omega-6 oils into these pro-inflammatory prostaglandins. Okay, so and it actually inhibits the anti-inflammatory pathway. We also know that cortisol robs the gut of protein, particularly leucine, from the gut. Okay, which is kind of crazy. So think about it. I'm very stressed out, and this is a pattern I've seen over and over again. We're working out like crazy. We're stressed out like crazy. Blah blah blah. We've got all these digestive issues, and no matter what you do, you clean up the gut, you do all the stuff, but you don't get the stress down. Your body or your gut is getting robbed of leucine, which is a branch chain amino acid, and you're basically in a net deficit all the time when it comes to leaky gut. Okay, so that's hopefully that's a clinical pearl right there, because not a lot of people know about that. We know that stress weakens our immune defenses. There's a lot of studies on that. Sugar basically suppresses our production of SIGA, okay, or secretory IgA. We know that it suppresses white blood cell counts and productions and so forth. We also know that stress, as we discussed earlier, can trigger dormant viruses to becoming active. So the most overt example there would be something like herpes, right? So cold sores. We all know anyone who suffers from cold sores, you know that it only comes around when you get stressed out. So what if that happened to be Epstein-Barr virus or cytomegalovirus or something else, right? And now that got kicked into high gear. The last one there is it impedes our ability to repair tissue, which sort of ties in with our point there on leucine and robbing the gut. Okay, so remember, your immune system is there to defend, but it's also there to repair. And if it's busy defending too much, you're never going to have a chance to repair tissue. And that is chronic degenerative disease. This is a big one. And this is something I'm still I'm getting a lot more comfortable working with this in clinic, but it's something that it's one of those very enigmatic, almost ethereal kind of things that I'm slowly starting to appreciate and wrap my head around. How many people on tonight's webinar, how many of you have heard of the vagus nerve? Can you just give me a shout out in the chat box, yes, or hands up or something like that? Anyone heard of the vagus nerve? Okay, cool. So I can see some hands going up. All right, so yeah, good few hands. Awesome. So the vagus nerve is not vagus like we're playing the slots. It's VAGUS. The vagus nerve is actually part of our cranial nerves. And there's about 13 of them that all come down from the head. And they essentially just branch out and cover the entire trunk of the body, right? So they tap into different organs. So you'll see the vagus nerve here is the main one. It's the most well-studied one. And it comes behind the ear and then goes down. And I think the next slide here, let me just have a look. So you'll see on the next slide, the vagus nerve actually ties in with our trachea or pharynx, our lungs. What else have we got here? We've got our liver. Okay, so just have a look here. We've got stomach, liver, spleen, pancreas, kidney, small intestine, large intestine. Okay, so when we talk about the gut-brain connection, the gut-brain connection was always a very nice idea for me, right? It was like, okay, cool. Yeah, I get it. Like if I think bad thoughts, it's going to suppress my HCl production. I'm not going to, I'm going to tighten up and maybe be constipated. But there was never anything tangible to really zoom in on. And what we now understand with the vagus nerve is essentially the highway, the bridge between the gut and the brain. It's essentially the gut is hardwired to the brain via something called the enteric nervous system. And what you're going to find is that trauma that we spoke about earlier, the trauma gets locked up in the nervous system, right? Well, which part of the nervous system? It turns out that it gets locked into the vagus nerve a lot. And what happens is it disconnects the gut and the brain. So you'll find that a lot of people with autoimmune issues, in addition to having the physical digestive issues, they will also say that their digestion, when it's off, impacts their mental health, right? So they'll feel more mood swings, anxiety, depression, and so forth. And so there's fantastic tools out there. I would encourage you to go and look at these. There's amazing tools, very simple, to help reestablish that connection between the gut and the brain via the vagus nerve. Okay, if you've had physical trauma, like a bike accident or someone, you've had something physically like whiplash or something like that, it might be a little bit harder. But for people who have had trauma or traumatic or stressful events, PTSD, and so forth, meditation, guided meditation, vagal nerve stimulation, I tell you what, it's a total game changer when it comes to dealing with autoimmune disease. Okay, total game changer. And I've noticed even with a lot of my clients, when I give them these types of exercises, they will actually tell me, because you and I might not appreciate it. We might go, oh, okay, wow, I did the exercise and now what? But for someone who suffers from this, when they do those exercises, it's a total game changer for them. They feel so much more calm, and their digestion starts to work much better. Right, so let's talk a little bit about functional lab testing. And I know that a lot of you on this webinar tonight, you don't have access to ordering lab tests, but I like to talk briefly about lab tests because a lot of you are working in clinics, you're working with naturopaths or maybe integrative MDs, chiropractors and so forth. And so what will happen is if you're working as a nutritionist in these clinics, you're going to see that people will bring these tests to you. You'll actually find even if you're not working in those tests, a lot of my clients have already done some of these tests through functional medicine practitioners or naturopaths, whoever. And so it's a good idea to just at least get a basic foundation in how to read a comprehensive digestive stool test or an organic acids test or so on. So I'm going to just skim through these and, watch the replay, take a screenshot of the slide here if you want. The comprehensive autoantibody test from Cyrex Labs is probably the best test I know that checks for antibodies for the most common autoimmune issues. The higher the autoantibodies, the more pronounced the autoimmune disease is. Personally, I don't run them because I'm not in a legal position to diagnose. But oftentimes I will say, hey, go and talk to your naturopath or go and talk to your doctor and get them to order that. A comprehensive digestive stool analysis, if you've never done one, it is a complete game changer. It evaluates everything from your pancreatic health to bile flow to immune system health in the gut, bacteria, parasites, yeast, and so on, leaky gut, okay, and so forth. Organic acids test is great for nutrient deficiencies. It's also very, very good for evaluating what's going on in the small intestine. Okay, so a stool test doesn't always tell us what's going on in the small intestine, or an organic acids test does. Okay, so it's very good. SIBO test is exactly what it is. It's a breath test. It just detects small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. There are bona fide leaky gut tests. I typically tend to not run those as much anymore because the digestive stool analysis now, they have zonulin markers and DAO and other things as well that you don't really need to run a separate test. But nonetheless, they're out there. They typically are lactulose mannitol tests or glucose tests. You drink a sugar solution that should not be absorbed, and if any amount shows up in your pee, you then know that you have some degree of leaky gut. Food allergy tests, that's a whole can of worms right there, but nonetheless, food allergy, sensitivity, and tolerance tests, however you want to do that. I do a lot of adrenal stress testing. Okay, people often wonder why, and the short answer is, it's not good enough to say that someone has adrenal fatigue anymore, because are you, which of the 7 stages of adrenal fatigue are you? Is your morning cortisol high or low? Are you high at night? Are you low at night? What does that diurnal pattern really look like? And that's where an adrenal stress test and a hormone test can really shed a lot of light on that. Heavy metals testing, environmental toxicity testing. There's some very, very niche tests like the CytoDX, which actually measures the cytokine activity. So you can actually tell which branches of the immune system are over or underactive. And then from a genetic standpoint, we have something like the immunogenomics test from Genova, which can tell us from a genetic standpoint, is someone weaker or more dominant with Th1 or Th2? Okay, so that's getting very, very granular there. But nonetheless, if that's the way you work, I've run those a few times, and I tell you what, been very, very insightful to run those. When you've tried everything else, that's when you start going into the immunogenomics and the genetic side of things. So let's talk about some therapeutic considerations here. I'll just put the huge caveat disclaimer out there. There are always, always, always multiple factors that are simultaneously involved with autoimmune disease. Okay, do not go with a shotgun approach. Do not go with a piecemeal approach. Do not just stick someone on a grain-free diet and give them digestive enzymes and go, okay, cool, let's see what happens. Because for you as a clinician, here's how it goes. Your clients that are coming in, if they don't start seeing results after 2 or 3 or 4 sessions, they're out of there. Okay, so you want to start looking at this and looking at the framework here. Okay, so what is the framework? I think we've got it here. What is the framework? How do we break the cycle of what's going on? Because there's a lot of moving parts. The biggest one to right out the gate is get rid of the stressors, right? So reduce the stressors, external stressors, internal stressors, vagal nerve stimulation, autonomic pairing. You want to identify and remove food allergens and triggers. We want to identify and remove pathogens and infections. Okay, this is a process. You're not just going to do all of this in one go, but look at what's going on here in these 4 points. Identify and remove, identify and remove, identify and remove. You see how we're removing everything? Okay, so we're lightening the load. We're lightening that allostatic load so that our client and our person has a chance to breathe, right? The nervous system can settle down. The digestion can start to get a little stronger. Then we want to move into stuff like, well, this is naturally all going to lower inflammation. We're going to support digestion. So through diet, through supplements, Okay, I would strongly suggest, we'll talk about diet in a minute, but a hypoallergenic diet is absolutely key. It's critical. Look at where we are down here, and this is in no particular order. I've tried to put them in some kind of order, but again, we're talking about a syndrome. And a syndrome is really a collection of symptoms that are orbiting or gravitating around a central theme. Okay, so healing the guts, can you see how far down that is on the list here? And the biggest mistake I see practitioners make, and it's not a mistake, it's just you're putting the cart before the horse, that's all. People go in there and they say, oh, we think you got leaky gut. Here's L-glutamine, here's NAG, here's branched-chain aminos, bam, bam, bam. And what you're doing is you haven't removed the triggers, you've tried to repair. And if you try and repair on top of a poor foundation, you're not going to get the results that you're looking for. Okay, you might get some symptomatic relief, you might get some short-term gains, but you're not going to get long-term gains. So focus on those first 4 or 5 points, support the digestion, and then start healing the gut. You're going to find that doing all of these things is going to balance the immune system out. Okay, this is another thing that I see practitioners do, is they start getting in there and they go, oh, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to go with andrographis in high doses. We're going to go with vitamin D. We're going to go with everything to try and suppress the immune system using supplements. And I look at it very differently. I say to myself, well, why am I trying to suppress the immune system if it's overactive? What's the point in doing that? The better question to ask is, why is it overactive? And typically what you're going to find is it's overactive because of food allergens, pathogens, infections, toxins, and so forth. So when we start removing those things out, the immune system is actually naturally going to balance itself out. So in functional medicine, we have something called secretory IgA, right? It's not functional medicine. It's just something we can look at. That is the key marker for intestinal immune system, immunity is SIGA, SIGA, okay? So there's literature out there now, and there's studies to show that when you remove pathogens and food allergens and whatever, your SIGA bounces back, okay? Your SIGA, your immune system bounces back. And if it's overactive and you remove them, your SIGA goes down. Okay, so just always think about that. Remove these things first before you start trying to load someone up with supplements and superfoods and whatever else. So general dietary recommendations, and I know this is very general. Okay, some people thrive on more of a vegan plant-based diet. Other people thrive on a carnivore diet. So we're going to try and split the difference here. And I will say that in my experience anyway, the diet that works the best for autoimmune issues as a starting point is going to be your specific carbohydrate diet, or your AIP, which is autoimmune paleo, or your GAPS diet, which is a little bit more radical than the first two. Okay, so it works very well. It's not easy to adhere to, but it works very, very well, at least to start with. Okay, remove common and or known allergens. So we discussed that previously. No grains, no legumes, no dairy or sugar. Okay, so a lot of people go, oh my gosh, I'm working with someone right now and they're just like, man, what am I supposed to eat, right? Focus on what you can eat. There's a lot of food you can eat on the AIP, a lot, okay? Meat, eggs, fish, vegetables, avocados, and the list goes on, okay? Plenty of healthy fats, so grass-fed animals, coconut oil, avocado, butter, essential fatty acids, omega-3s, and so forth. Nutrient-dense organic foods. Okay, I cannot stress organic enough. I would encourage you to go and listen to a podcast I did with Jeffrey Smith, who's Mr. GMO, right? He did a documentary called Secret Ingredients. And he had a few families that the one family of 4 had 42 diagnosed diseases between them. And the oldest member of that family is 45 years old. They went all organic. And I think within 2 months, almost all of those diseases were gone, just from going organic. Okay, so organic is absolutely key, and a lot of people just don't want to do it, and they wonder why the supplements aren't working and all this other stuff. Okay, so you've got to go organic, nutrient dense, fruits, vegetables, and so forth, and variety is absolutely key. When it comes to supplements, I mean, there's literally bags and bags of supplements that you could be taking. You're not going to do all of these things at the same time. You're going to evaluate where you are on the roadmap, right? So are we removing things? Are we detoxifying? Are we supporting digestion? Are we getting rid of infections? Are we doing a SIBO protocol? So there's a lot of nuance to how to use supplements. And if you sat in any of my classes, you will know that I'm a huge proponent for critical thinking. Okay, just forget about the cookie cutter. Don't look at protocols. Think about the protocol, and then how can I massage that? How do I modify that and tailor it so that it's unique to that individual that I'm working with in clinic right now? So digestive support, HDL, enzymes, bile, bitters, there's ferments and kombuchas, medicinal kombuchas, they all work very, very well. Adrenal support, I don't have a favorite formula. You're going to have to just figure out, what their diurnal pattern is and go from there. But I will say that adrenal support, it's an interesting one because I never appreciated adrenal support right out the gate. And I'm finding myself now more and more these days is adrenal support's actually coming right out the gate. Because adrenal support, I want to try and calm that central nervous system down, right? We want to try and get them out of that fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so adrenal support can really make a big difference there. Antimicrobials to get rid of infections. I mean, there are literally dozens of them, from oregano oil to berberine, olive leaf, the list goes on and on and on. Silver, grapefruit seed extract. So it really depends on what type of infection you're actually trying to work on. Anti-inflammatories, again, there are like dozens and dozens. I've just pulled out a few here. Curcumin, boswellia or frankincense. Cat's claw is actually a very, very good one, which is anti-inflammatory and also an immunomodulator. And then something as simple as ginger. We want to replenish nutrient deficiencies. Now, I know a lot of you watching this, you might be using the NutriBody. I saw in one of the nutrition groups, someone asked that question, like who's actually using it? And yeah, a lot of people are still using that. But you'll find that, people are coming from doctors with vitamin D tests, B12 and so forth. Iron is another big one. But these 6 that I've pulled out are the most common nutrient deficiencies when it comes to leaky gut specifically. Okay, we know that vitamin D is a very powerful immunomodulator, so that's always a front and center when it comes to autoimmune issues. But you'll see that B12 as well, particularly with things like MS and Raynaud's and so forth. B12 is very, very commonly deficient. Gut healing nutrients like L-glutamine, N-acetylglucosamine or NAG, BCAAs, probiotics, prebiotics, the list goes on. You'll see that I've put a couple of little stars here next to probiotics. And the reason why I've done that is probiotics are immune modulators. As much as they replenish gut health and gut flora, they actually modulate the immune system. So for people that are very sensitive, you got to be a little bit careful about what strains you're using and also what potency you're using. Okay, so sometimes you'll find that very high doses of probiotics can actually really aggravate someone with immune issues or autoimmune issues. Okay, immune modulators, as I said, vitamin D, mushroom extracts are huge. So I do a lot of product education and training for Paul Stamets and for Host Defense mushrooms. So I've learned a lot about mushrooms in the last few years. And I tell you what, mushrooms are awesome on so many levels, but you'll find that they work, when you look at the immune system and you've got, your T1, T2, T3, T9, T17, and so forth, these branches of the immune system, you'll find that mushrooms are perfect immune modulators because they work on the Treg cells or the Th3 cells. These are our helper cells. And so if you're worried about boosting the immune system or am I going to depress the immune system too much, mushrooms are a pretty safe bet. Okay, astragalus and andrographis. By the way, andrographis in high doses is actually an immunosuppressant, and in low doses is an immune stimulant. Okay, so just a bit of an FYI there on the side. So as I said before, you got to be approached with caution here. Some supplements can definitely aggravate symptoms and make them worse. I actually am working with someone right now where I didn't even get them on a ton of supplements, but just putting them on a GAPS diet and removing the triggers caused so much die-off that they could barely function. Right. So I had to really navigate that a lot because it's concerning, when you remove those triggers and all of a sudden you starve the bacteria and the yeast and whatever else is going on, Likewise, if you go there with antimicrobials and just start wiping them out, or probiotics and just start wiping them out, people can have very, very negative reactions. And with autoimmune disease, what that translates to is that it's going to cause flare-ups. And so things are going to get a lot worse before they get better if you push too hard in the beginning. That we're going to wrap things up, and just, whether you're watching this live on the chat or whether you're on YouTube or wherever, just ask yourself what, I would love to know what your biggest takeaways have been. And do you notice any common threads or themes that are running through autoimmune disease? So I'm going to leave it at that and say a big thank you. That's from my side. Julia, I'm going to hand the mic back over to you.
Brett, I have to tell you, after knowing you for 14 years, 15 years.
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Every single time that we are on phone, email, when I see you in class, you're just marvelous, just totally passionate, and you just blow me away every time. So thank you again for your time this evening. I know that you had a good time. You always like these things, don't you?
I love it. Yeah. I mean, I love teaching. I love talking about this stuff, helping people. And if you take stuff away and it will help you in your practice or help yourself, hey, that's good. It's exponential healing is what it's all about. So
no, you're great. And it's wonderful. So thank you again, and good night.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.